She was known for her silence, not the awkward kind that made rooms uncomfortable, but a silence that felt deliberate, almost dignified. People assumed she was calm, strong, and unbothered. They mistook her quietness for peace. No one suspected that her silence was not empty. It was crowded. Her name was Zoya. Zoya learned silence early in life. As a child, she discovered that speaking did not always lead to being heard. When she cried, she was told to be patient. When she asked questions, she was told not to think too much. When she expressed fear, she was reminded that others had it worse. Slowly, words lost their usefulness. Silence, on the other hand, kept her safe. As she grew older, silence became her language. It protected her from disappointment and judgment. It allowed her to observe without being exposed. People spoke freely around her because they believed she wouldn't repeat their words. They trusted her, not knowing that every confession, every careless remark, settled deep inside her like another locked door. Zoya carried many secrets, but the heaviest ones were her own. She was the woman who listened when others needed comfort. Friends called her strong. Family called her reliable. At work, she was praised for her composure. No one asked how she managed to remain so composed. No one noticed how often she stared out of windows, how she lingered in empty rooms long after everyone had left. Inside her, there was a constant hum of unspoken thoughts. Zoya had loved once, deeply and quietly. She loved in the way silent people do, fully, without demands, without drama. She gave space, understanding, and patience. When that love ended, it didn't end loudly. There were no arguments, no accusations, just absence. A slow withdrawal of attention, a gradual realization that she was alone even when someone was beside her. She never told anyone how much that hurt. Instead, she smiled when asked how she was. She said she was fine. Over time, even she began to believe it, or at least she learned how to live as if it were true. Psychology calls this emotional suppression, but for Zoya, it was survival. Feeling too much had never been rewarded. Silence had. Years passed. Life continued. Responsibilities replaced desires. Routine replaced hope. Zoya's days became predictable, and predictability felt safer than possibility. Yet at night, when the world quieted, her thoughts grew louder. She replayed conversations she never had. She imagined explaining herself to people who never asked. She wondered who she might have been if she had spoken sooner, louder, or more honestly. The secrets she carried were not dramatic. There were no crimes, no scandals. Her secrets were subtle and heavy. Unfulfilled dreams, unanswered questions, love that was never returned in the same measure. These are the kinds of secrets that don't shock others, but slowly reshape the self. Zoya knew how to disappear emotionally while remaining physically present. At gatherings, she laughed at the right moments. She nodded in agreement. She asked polite questions. But she never revealed the ache beneath her calm exterior. Vulnerability felt dangerous. Psychologically, Zoya had learned to associate intimacy with loss. Every time she grew close, something slipped away. So she stopped reaching. She told herself she was independent, self-sufficient, complete. Society praised her for it, reinforcing the belief that needing less made her stronger. But strength without connection is a lonely thing. There were moments when her silence felt like a betrayal to herself. Times when she wanted to scream, to confess, to be seen without having to explain. Yet the words remained trapped. Silence had become automatic, almost involuntary. One evening, after a particularly long day, Zoya sat alone in her apartment. The lights were dim. The city outside was alive with noise and movement. She felt strangely separate from it all, as if life were happening somewhere else. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge the weight she carried. She realized that her silence had protected others, more than it had protected her. It had kept people comfortable while she absorbed discomfort. It had preserved harmony while erasing parts of her own voice. This realization did not bring immediate relief, but it brought clarity. And clarity can be painful. Zoya began to write. She wrote about the moments she stayed quiet when she should have spoken. She wrote about the love she never asked for and the help she never requested. She wrote about the fear of being too much and the exhaustion of being too little. The words surprised her. They were raw, unfiltered, and alive. On paper, she was not calm or composed. She was human. Writing didn't solve everything, but it cracked something open. It reminded her that silence was a choice she had made once to survive, not a rule she had to follow forever. Still, change came slowly. Zoya did not suddenly become outspoken or bold. Her transformation was subtle. She began by answering honestly when someone asked how she was. She allowed pauses in conversations instead of filling them with politeness. She declined invitations she didn't want to accept, and accepted ones she genuinely did. These small acts felt radical. The secrets didn't disappear, but they loosened their grip. Some secrets, she realized, were not meant to be revealed to others. They were meant to be acknowledged internally. Silence is not always harmful. Sometimes it is sacred. The damage comes when silence replaces truth entirely. Zoya remained a quiet woman. But her silence changed. It was no longer a shield built from fear. It became a space she chose, not one she hid behind. People still saw her as calm, but now there was depth in her presence, a groundedness that came from knowing herself, not from avoiding herself. She didn't need to tell her whole story to be real. She only needed to stop hiding it from herself. Her many secrets no longer defined her. They became part of her history, not her prison. And in that quiet transformation, Zoya discovered something she had never allowed herself to believe before: that silence can coexist with truth, and that being unseen by the world does not mean being lost to oneself. If you ever feel unheard or unseen, remember that your story matters, even if you're the only one who knows it. If you need support, please reach out to mental health professionals. As Zoya moved through her days, she started noticing just how much silence shaped her world. It wasn't just about the secrets she kept, but also about what other people saw in her quietness. To some, she was wise. To others, she seemed distant or aloof. A few even thought her silence meant she didn't care. And in a way, none of them were completely wrong, but none of them were truly right either. You see, silence is like a blank canvas. It invites people to paint their own picture. When someone doesn't share much about themselves, others tend to fill in the gaps with their own ideas and assumptions. Zoya had lived inside these assumptions for years. They acted as a shield, protecting her from prying questions, but they also trapped her in an identity she never really chose for herself. There were so many moments when she desperately wanted to speak up, to correct them and say, "That's not who I am inside." But to correct them, she would have to explain. And to explain, she would have to be vulnerable. And vulnerability? That scared her more than any misunderstanding ever could. Her secrets were layered, like an onion. Some were ghosts from the past. Times she wanted something with all her heart but pretended she didn't. Others were ongoing battles, needs she still denied herself because admitting to them felt selfish. She had taught herself to choose emotional stability over emotional honesty. Psychologically, this is called avoidance coping. It's a strategy that helps you feel better in the short term, but it quietly builds up a massive amount of emotional strain over the long run. And Zoya felt that strain, physically. Her shoulders were always tight, like they were carrying an invisible weight. Sleep was a restless visitor, arriving late and leaving early. She often felt exhausted, even on days when she had done nothing at all. These weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of containment. Holding back emotions takes energy. Suppressing your true desires takes effort. When silence goes on for too long, it becomes hard labor. One afternoon, she ran into an old acquaintance. They had a brief, polite chat. As they were about to part ways, the woman said, "You know, you're exactly the same." Zoya managed a smile, but inside, something clenched. Exactly the same didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a life sentence. The truth was, change had been happening inside her all along. It was just invisible to everyone else. That evening, Zoya opened her notebook again. As she wrote about that small encounter, she had a breakthrough. Her silence had kept her safe from conflict, yes, but it had also kept her from being truly seen. People can't celebrate the growth they were never invited to witness. This realization brought a new kind of sadness, not for what she had lost, but for all the things she had never allowed to even begin. Psychological growth often starts with discomfort. When you start questioning the coping mechanisms you've relied on for years, your mind fights back. For Zoya, that resistance showed up as doubt. She worried, if I start speaking up, will people think I'm needy? If I show my emotions, will I overwhelm them? If I'm finally honest, will I lose the stability I've worked so hard to build? But she was starting to see that stability without authenticity felt empty. It felt hollow. So she started to experiment. Not with dramatic confessions or big emotional outbursts, just with small, quiet truths. When someone asked how she was, she'd admit she was tired instead of just saying, "I'm fine." She started expressing her preferences instead of automatically letting others decide. And with each tiny act of honesty, she waited for the disaster she was sure would follow. But nothing catastrophic happened. This genuinely surprised her. Her nervous system had been trained for years to expect rejection. Yet, in reality, people responded with simple neutrality, or sometimes, even with warmth. This completely challenged the story she had told herself for decades. The story that her needs were too much for others to handle. Of course, some secrets remained private, and she learned to be okay with that. Not every truth needs to be shouted from the rooftops. But she also learned that some truths need to be acknowledged, just to yourself, to strip them of their power. Zoya was learning to tell the difference. Her silence didn't disappear. Instead, it softened. It transformed from a hiding place into a space for reflection. She still spoke less than most people, but when she did speak, her words had weight. They came from a place of being true to herself, not from a place of self-protection. The woman who had spent so long being emotionally invisible was slowly, carefully, returning to herself. Zoya finally understood that silence was never the enemy. Fear was. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being dismissed, the fear of being seen, really seen, and not being chosen. She was still a woman with many secrets, but those secrets no longer had a chokehold on her. They were a part of her, acknowledged and integrated, no longer demanding silence as their only hiding place. And in that quiet, personal evolution, Zoya found something incredibly rare. It wasn't a life without pain, but it was a life with self-respect. It wasn't a loud, flashy transformation, but a steady, quiet truth.